everyone. Welcome to the Thrive Neurosport podcast series. I'm your host, Katie Mitchell. I'm a PhD candidate, a registered physiotherapist, and certified athletic therapist. And on this podcast series, we're going to be discussing the latest research in concussion education, management, and rehabilitation to thrive on in sport and life. Today, I'm really excited to have Michael Jorgensen from the University of Toronto. He's a PhD student. He specializes in sport-related concussion risk and prevention. Mike is a Trent University alumni where he completed both his Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science degrees. During his time at Trent, he competed for the Trent men's rugby team and the Peterborough Rugby Football Club, and he was named an OUA All-Star in his final season. His athletic experiences have played a critical role in guiding his academic pursuits, which we will discuss a little bit more today. With his background in health psychology, Mike's previous research examined athletes' attitudes and intentions around concussion risk and protective behaviors. More recently, he has shifted focus away from individual athletes and moved towards the systems. For example, the rules and policies that facilitate or hinder the success of injury prevention in sport. Mike also hosts a sports science podcast called The Athletic Perspective. Welcome to the podcast, Mike. I'm really excited to have you on today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
He's taking time away from studying for his comprehensive exam, so I really appreciate you finding the time to join us. What I thought we'd start with today is just kind of discussing your background in sport and how that sort of fueled your research focus and kind of how you've evolved that over time into where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So where should I start? Like back at the beginning with when I first started playing rugby, or?
Wherever you want. You can start with sort of how you got into even like university rugby and kind of building from there. We both have kind of experience with rugby and know those environments. So if you can speak a little bit to that culture.
Yeah, so I started playing rugby in high school and I really enjoyed it. It was a way to sort of get out, run around with my friends, and I really enjoyed the physicality and the culture around it. Which with that, it's one of competition, but also a very big component of that is respect for the game and respect for your opponents in terms of competition that way, which I think for me, like just the ethos of that just really resonated. And so I played that in high school, loved it, had a lot of fun, did great. And when I started my bachelor's at my undergrad at Trent, I reached out to the coach, David McCulley, and ended up trying out for the team and making it and playing for quite a number of years because I did my undergrad degree and then I did my my master's there as well consecutively. So that allowed me to stick around a little bit longer than most people are able to, which was great. And so, my background, as Katie, as you mentioned, is in psychology, specifically health psychology. So my undergrad, I did a lot of courses around health psychology and behavior modification, and there wasn't really a heavy sport focus. But given that I was playing rugby and competing, and I like to train and stuff like that, that was slowly kind of involved itself in my academic life too. And when I was in, I think, third year, I guess this was like 2012 or 2013, we had been playing, I think we were about halfway through our season, and I was planning on applying for law school, and I was about to write my LSAT, and everything was going great, and then I got a really bad concussion in one of our games. And it left me out for quite a bit. I was still able to come back that season, but at that point, I didn't really know a lot about the injury, and it was just one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, someone has a concussion, you sit in a dark room, wait a week and shake it off kind of thing, and you get back out there. But it was interesting that in me getting that injury, I wasn't able to write my LSAT and I ended up missing the application round for that year. So it must have been third year then is when it was. So yeah, and I missed the application round. So here I am finishing up my third year, not really knowing what the plan is for my fourth year and beyond. Now that I missed that application deadline, and things are starting. I was a little worried, to say the least. And I reached out to one of my professors who does a lot of neuro learning and behavior kind of research, Dr. Hugo Lehman, and I asked to do some research with them, and we were looking at adult neurogenesis and some of the stuff around that, which was kind of interesting. But it wasn't really what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what that was, but I knew like this wasn't quite it. And so it was fine. It was a good experience, and he was a great mentor. And then after all of this kind of went down with my head injury, after the season, we ended up having sort of an alumni event with previous Trent rugby players and coaches, and I ended up bumping into Dr. Fergal O'Hagan, who is also a faculty in the Trent Psych department, but I hadn't met at that point, which is kind of funny because Trent's so small, so I don't know how that is possible, but it happened. And so instead of meeting at Trent, where I spend all day, every day, I end up meeting him at this rugby function, which was kind of fun. And anyway, I'd mentioned I was doing that research with Hugo, but I said, like, this isn't quite what my interest is. And then we started talking a little bit about concussions, and I said, you know what, maybe that's what I would like to study. And my experience was so interesting with that, and it kind of threw me for a loop in terms of like long-term plans, and it is what it is, but I think that would be something really interesting. And he says, well, why don't we do that? So Dr. Hugo Lehman, Dr. Fergal O'Hagan, and myself started this project, which turned into my undergrad thesis, and then my master's thesis, now publications, and so forth, so on. And so that was how something very, very tiny kind of snowballed into something that's a pretty major part of my life, I'd say. And so I did my undergrad thesis looking at some of this stuff, and then in my master's that really sort of expanded on that. And so that's really how my athletic experience, especially my experience with concussion, sort of funneled into that academic pursuit too. And then since then, I specialized in not just psychology, but health psychology specifically. And then from there, with my master's of science in health psychology, and then now I'm at U of T in exercise science. And so, you'd mentioned in that brief introduction that I'm looking at some of those individual factors and have moved to more systemic stuff. And I found that was also reflective of my choice of programs, where I went from Trent and psychology, which is very, very specific with psychological theories and the psychological perspective. So everything was kind of through that lens. And I found, that was great, but there are a lot of other ways of addressing the problem too. And so when I applied to U of T, that was sort of my intention, is with their exercise science department, it's very multidisciplinary. So there's the behavioral and the sociocultural and the biophysical kind of aspects, and there's a lot of sort of involvement from all of those. So I'm encouraged to sort of address the problem with not just a psychological lens, which I appreciate.
Oh, that's great. That's really interesting. It's funny how like the timing of sort of based on your timeline of even when you had your injury to when you were kind of starting your research is sort of around the time where it was a big pivotal sort of, with the Rowan Stringers, the incident in 2013, right. That sort of, springboarded that whole legislation towards Rowan's Law. And that was sort of around the same time where that, like, all of a sudden, especially rugby, it got a lot of spotlight around concussion, and sort of all of a sudden there was everybody sort of looking at it. And that's sort of where research also kind of blew up as well. And it was sort of along my own timeline where I started to recognize these things. And before that, nobody really knew how to address it. And you were kind of in that area, like sort of that timeline too, of like where there's still a lot of unknown, and we still have a lot of unknown remaining today, but we know a heck of a lot more than we did 7 years ago. So, and as you mentioned, like now you're kind of you went from more of a specific to multidisciplinary department where you're looking at it from, multiple lenses, where like that is more kind of reflective of what a concussion is, because it has so much complexity to it that looking at it just from one perspective is not going to really capture all of the information you're looking for. So I'm curious of what I know you published a paper a couple years ago looking at like the individual kind of like behaviors and characteristics around concussion risk and those behaviors. So if you can expand a little bit on like what you found with that and talk about kind of how it applies to sport and prevention.
Yeah, so that project, that paper in particular, kind of came out of a little brainstorming session we had to really try and own in on, what are we asking? What's the question? And, spending time at the rugby club and with other, coaching and being involved in other stuff, time and time again, it was, well, injury is just part of the game. Well, if you change something major, then is it really still rugby? Or, how do we maintain this level of competition? And so it all kind of boiled down to our question was, well, how can we maintain the competitive integrity of the game while also keeping the players safe? And so, as we started to build out, it was like, well, what sort of questions should we be asking? And if you look at the research, at least at the time, it's not so much the case now, but it was back in 2012. A lot of the research was on management, identification and management, and the only really sort of primary prevention, and by that I mean preventing the injury from occurring altogether, that was going on was education. Which is great, and we can see that the growing awareness around that time and the media, sort of helping with that. But everything sort of focused on the management and rehabilitation side, less so the prevention side. And so, we started talking about, well, how can we prevent this? But at that time, a lot of the research was focused on equipment, and focused on, like helmets and mouth guards, which was the belief at the time that perhaps that could somehow protect your head. I don't know where the rationale was, but anyway. So, and then, like I said, so education, and we're looking at this and we're saying, well, yeah, that's great, but here's this big issue where, and especially around what you had mentioned with Rowan Stringer, here's this huge issue where athletes just aren't reporting their injuries. And so here's this big issue of underreporting in sport. And so, we kind of latched onto that, where that's the specific area that we wanted to focus on. Well, how do we get people to report? Well, why don't they report? Well, what happens? Who are the types of athletes who might not report? And so that's where we started getting into this idea of what are their attitudes and beliefs and intentions towards those sort of protective or non-reporting, being sort of risk-taking, conceptually a risk-taking behavior. And so that's sort of where it was founded from, is this lack of primary prevention and this interest in why athletes are behaving the way they are. And so, a lot of theories in psychology and public health kind of focus on this idea of, knowledge equals behavior change. But there's some limitation to that when it's applied to an athlete sample, because a lot of them sort of are founded on the assumption that people are going to act in accordance with what is best for their health. And we know a lot of the times athletes don't. and this is this, yeah, right. It's that competitive drive, or that want to do more, that one lap, right? Let's get back out there. Kind of, there's tons of different factors that go into that. But the fact of the matter is, education's good, knowledge is good, but it's good as a start, and it doesn't, at least to what the research has shown, is it hasn't really translated into actual behavior change. It hasn't translated into better reporting behaviors. At least it hasn't dealt with that sort of underreporting problem. And like you said, with Rowan Stringer, that incident kind of becoming very, very public, especially around so second impact and going back in without recovering, hiding the injury from your parents, from your coaches, from your teammates, like all of that kind of factored into our interest in that particular topic area. And so, the question then was, if not knowledge, then what? And so put my psychological glasses on and looked at it through the psychological theories. And one of the things that sort of popped up was this idea of risk perceptions and subjective norms and attitudes and intentions. And so the idea with that is that, people have a set of attitudes, which are thoughts or feelings towards a particular thing. So in this case, concussion or concussion management or what have you. And then attitudes drive intentions, and our intentions drive our behaviors. So that's the sort of rationale or going theory, I guess. And so we developed a questionnaire, and this questionnaire assessed athletes' attitudes and their intentions to engage in protective behaviors and risk-taking behaviors. And so, our main question was, like I said, what are their thoughts? What are their attitudes? What are their intentions? And sort of who are the athletes that hold these particular, whatever will come of this, whatever we'll find, who are, can we sort of classify these into different clusters or different sort of categories. And so our thought with that was, again, in one of these brainstorming sessions, is like, well, what do you see when you're out playing? That was what they asked me. What do you see? It's like, well, I see a few guys who, they'll do anything they possibly can to make sure they're at the highest level of highest level of compete that they possibly can be. And if that means hiding symptoms to get back in, these are your kind of bad actors in that sense. They're your sort of red flag athletes. And, some of my buddies are kind of like that and whatever, and that's fine, but that's an issue. On the other hand, there's some guys who will totally do whatever, spend hours in the gym to get as fit as they possibly can, and do, they're the kind of guys who are doing, an hour warm up and an hour cool down, while everybody else is just kind of having the water cooler chat on the side of the field. They're the guys in the middle of the fields doing the stretches, and you know what I mean? Like just going so above and beyond what they can do to like maintain that wellness. And so that was kind of our idea, is like, well, there's definitely, those two types of athletes aren't the same. And so, how do they differ in those attitudes, and how do they differ in their intentions? And so, so we developed this questionnaire, sent it out to some of the athletes at Trent, and we got it back. And so some examples of some of the dimensions in terms of attitudes. So, something like risk acceptance. So a question we would have on there is, I would risk suffering a concussion in order to succeed in a sport that matters to me. Or competitiveness. My competitive nature increases my risk for concussion. Or management. Hiding concussion symptoms increases my risk for injury. So these are thoughts or feelings they have towards those particular things that will then drive intentions and behaviors and so forth. And then, so what we found is we found essentially three sort of clusters. So what we did is it's called a cluster analysis, and it takes this wide range of responses to these different dimensions, and it clusters them, it groups them based on averages and so forth. And so we found sort of three clusters of responses, and particularly in regarding to their attitudes. And so we found we found sort of these, I don't want to frame this. These three clusters were, we categorized as sort of proactive athletes, reactive athletes, and indifferent athletes. And so aptly named, as as I was kind of explaining the typical behaviors before. And so where we see these proactive athletes, these are, like I said, those, if you can imagine it, the guy in the middle of the field doing his stretches, cool down an hour after practice is done. So they had very, very positive, very strong intentions to avoid high risk situations, to properly manage, to wear protective equipment if they believe that would help them stay safe. Fitness, so there's fitness questions in there, so things like neck strength, if they believe that would decrease the risk for injury, would they engage in that, and confrontation, even some like social questions around like confronting aggressive opponents for the risk that they cause others, or highlighting it to the ref that a particular teammate even or opponent is engaging in some high risk or dangerous play. And so this proactive athlete cluster responded very strongly, very positively on all of those. I will engage in these. Whereas the reactive were sort of all, they didn't really say that they would engage in any of those with the exception of management. So it's one of those things where it's like, I'm not going to go out of my way to do all this stuff. I wouldn't confront an aggressive opponent. I wouldn't, that's just not who I am. But like, if I get injured, yeah, I'll report it. Right. And so that's why we kind of classified them as the reactive, because it's, none of those sort of proactive behaviors. And then lastly, which was roughly about a third of our sample, fell into the indifferent cluster. And so in terms of their intentions, they held no intent to engage in any risk reduction behaviors. And most importantly, they were significantly against any management behaviors. They reported very, very low intent to engage in any management behaviors. And so that instantly was a red flag for us. It's like, okay, so then the next question was, who are these athletes and why do they think that? Why do they hold these intentions? And so we dug into that a little bit more, and we found that a lot of these athletes had experience with concussion. They were exposed to concussion either indirectly through, like they had a friend or someone who had sustained a concussion in sport, or they themselves also had experience with one or multiple concussions. And so, when we look at that and start to get into why, some of the thoughts we had were, well, perhaps they just had a very bad experience in their recovery, right? So they don't believe in the efficacy of the management. So why would they engage in the management? Here we have, and this wasn't part of the study, but just kind of looking forward past the study and our sort of next steps identified in that paper were, here you have athletes who had concussions, went through the management protocols, had a bad experience potentially, and now say, I'm not doing that. I'm not engaging in this. I'm not reporting it. I'm just not. And so the question is, why not? And so whether that's belief in the system or social pressures or whatever, that's kind of the big that we found there.
Yeah, I'm curious. Did you have include this survey with multiple sports, or is it just in rugby in particular?
Not just rugby. So this was all varsity sports at Trent.
Was there any trends in the actual sports themselves that contained more of these indifferent or reactive or proactive categories?
There were some, but not enough that it's hard because with the there's not a lot of athletes at Trent.
Right.
So it's hard to pull any meaningful conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Tentatively, a lot of them, most of them, played contact sports, but not all. Right. So, or collision sports. So that would be, rugby. We had the hockey team involved in that. The lacrosse team, volleyball, rowing. So there's a wide range, both soccer teams. So very wide range of athletes. But it wasn't anything in particular about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that education doesn't always kind of result in intentional behaviors. Because I do find, like, even myself as a researcher, like I walk into a practice and everyone's like, oh, the concussion, person's here. And they're like, oh, like they know, like they've been educated about it, but they're almost just like, I don't want to be reminded of like what could be taken away from me potentially with an injury like this. And some of them are, like you said, like proactive in the sense that they're like really keen to be involved and they want to learn about it in that sense. And then others are just like, I'll deal with it when it happens. And then there's those people who, even some who experience like game to game, persistent symptoms and necessarily don't manage it or report it properly. Because, I've seen studies that say like playing a rugby game is like experiencing a small car accident every week. So there are definitely, even like a subconcussive kind of accumulation there. But I'm just curious based on, so like what you've kind of brought this around to is really like kind of where you are now, looking at more of the systematic approach and all the other stakeholders involved. Because, based on those experiences, like who influenced that experience? Like, was it a coach? Was it, therapy or lack thereof therapy? Was it a physician? Was it, like a more of a parent or family member or friend that had a concussion that influenced like their perspective and sort of what they view it as? So that's really interesting because I've definitely seen that trend myself, just anecdotally, of like, some people who even reactively, like they realize that they're having persistent symptoms or prolonged symptoms and they didn't necessarily deal with it right away. But then like 2-3 months later, they're like, okay, this isn't really going away. Whether their season potentially ended and they just left it. And then, in January, February, I end up talking to them or something then. So it starts to impact other parts of their daily life, even though their sport, the season has ended, for example.
Yeah. And, that's something I don't think I mentioned before, but there's mandatory concussion training for all athletes at this point. So all of them had undergone seminars with the varsity or athletics department through there, as well as certain teams like rugby, for instance, went and did the world rugby modules, and you know what I mean. So they're educated, they're knowledgeable about it, Definitely. They know about it, and here's their intentions despite that.
Yeah, and I don't want to throw like necessarily like a university therapy clinic under the bus, but I feel like a lot of the concussions that occur at the high school level, because a lot of kids come out of high school with experiencing probably at least one based on their sport experience. And at that level, there isn't always like a therapist available, or, they just kind of go see a random physician with a sort of family GP, who isn't always the most knowledgeable person to be seeing then. And so I find once they reach varsity, like they've already kind of got that experience. So especially if they're playing at a higher level to get to varsity, they've probably been playing, a collision sport for 3-4 years prior. So I wonder if that's potentially another kind of influencer, is perhaps their experience prior to even entering a more like organized sport, for example, at that level.
Yeah, and that's when we look at things like, their beliefs around that. And, we kind of joked around earlier about the mouth guard thing, but like that's common. That's still to some extent common, right?
Or the collar,
Yeah. And so, yes, I take this and I'm thinking about it, and it's, well, what's the solution? And it's a lot bigger than the conclusion I came to was that, it's a lot bigger than just that individual, because there's tons of different factors that go into it. Like even considering the seminar that they had to sit in from the athletics department or whatever, even that, it's like, well, who makes that up? Who understands the content without? There's no standard, there's consensus statements and stuff that we can rely on, but even that, it's like, well, who are those experts, and who is not in that is also an expert, you know what I mean? Like, there's just so much. It's such a new field, and I think, that was one of the reasons why I've liked this so much, because it's so emergent, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore that for me anyway, academically, but it just there's never a shortage of questions.
Exactly. It's like, well, I remember, I think it was Kevin Gaskowitz said, studying concussions is like studying a black hole, where it's just like a continuous process of evolving questions. I'm curious now, based on this previous research that you did, and obviously like some of your recommendations is looking at the other influences and the other stakeholders around the sports that you had looked into. So talk a little bit maybe now about where you're at, like kind of steering your research focus towards that more global approach to it.
Yeah, so like I said, I've taken more of a systemic approach to it, and realizing that there are, the psychologist in me would say, well, if not their attitudes, if not their intentions, let's find other personal factors, whether they're modifiable or not, and explore that. Very individualized. But like you said, there's a lot of factors that go into that, with coaches and ATs and whatever, right? The whole culture aspect of it. And so that, like I said, led me to sort of look at it through a multidisciplinary lens, or want to look at it through a multidisciplinary lens. And that's, like I said, led me to U of T. And so some of my stuff now is looking at more broadly, so different types of primary prevention. So now that it's been, I don't know, I think 7 years, I guess, since I started doing that research. It's come a long way since, it's just education, or it's helmets or mouth guards, right? The idea of primary prevention has started to take a bit of a foothold, which is good, because it's looking at aspects to prevent the injury from occurring altogether. So when we look at that, a big factor has been rule changes and policy as well. So the Rowan's Law, or the license law in the States, and so forth. But particular one of interest for me, going back to my main question, again, how do we keep the players safe while maintaining the competitive integrity of the sport? That to me just screams out rule changes. And so there's a lot of different, looks at or research around that, where in one hand you can get, things like there's one research article I read recently that looked at rule change in terms of limiting the amount of interchanges or subs you're allowed. And the rationale was, well, if you allow more subs, the tired people can get off, and tired people are at risk for more injury, not just concussion in particular, but looking at broadly at the sport injury literature. And so, get the tired people off, put fresh legs on, and risk is going to go down, injuries are going to go down. And what happened was actually quite the opposite, where injuries went up and risk went up. And I thought that it was such a fun article to read, because it's like, oh, that goes against what the first thought is. And the idea was that when you limit the number of interchanges, when you keep the amount of subs allowed low, there's no mismatches in terms of athletic, in terms of intensity, in terms of fitness, getting into, say, rugby in particular was what this study was looking at, getting into that 60th, 80th minute.
Like all the fatigue. Yeah.
Yeah. So the fatigue plays a part, and the fitness or fatigue sets in, and the speed of the game goes down. And when the speed of the game goes down, the impacts go down. And when the impact, you know what I mean? So it has a sort of cumulative effect. And I think that really stuck out to me, because that's something where that's a very simple rule change that doesn't impact anybody's ability to compete, but it impacts the end result in terms of injury risk. And so what I've been looking at recently is, talking to specific stakeholders who are involved in stuff like that. So within the sporting system, so your typical athlete, parents, coaches, medical staff, but also some of those folks that haven't really been explored very much in terms of sport administration and club presidents, say, in terms of rugby, or even referees. And so that's sort of here's the referee, which is essentially the gatekeeper for these rule changes, is the arbiter of whether these can be effective or not, and yet nobody's really asking them their thoughts on this. And so when we look at say rugby, for example, which I'm probably going to pull all my examples from rugby, is you have a yellow card and you have the red card, and those were instituted as injury prevention or risk reduction strategies. You do something dangerous, but maybe unintentional, you get a yellow card, you sit under the sticks in the end zone, and you think really hard about what you've done.
In the sin bin, yeah.
In the sin bin, exactly. You do something quite dangerous and likely intentional, you get your red card, you're out of the game. Well, there's presentations of that, and it's a very public act, and the referee pulling that out, and they are the manager of when that happens. And so it's interesting because different sports go about this differently. In rugby, you have one referee, a head referee, potentially two ARs. More often than not, it's just a player on one of the other teams running up and down the sideline with a little flag. But potentially you have ARs. But then in hockey, you have several referees for 12 athletes on at a time, whereas rugby, say 1 and 30 athletes. And so there's different ratios and then the culture comes into that, where you see, in football or lacrosse, or someone, yelling at a referee, whereas the culture in rugby is maybe, you don't do that so much. People kind of get on you if you get in the referee's face. And so different sporting cultures have their different ways of managing that. And looking even to, mentioning the referee thing, referees in rugby have always had the ability, or at least this rule implementation was relatively old now. I think it's about 10 or 15 years now, where if they see someone with a suspected injury, they can remove them from the game. And now it's been updated more recently to include concussion language specifically. Yeah. And they have the power. They are the final say. Doesn't matter what the coach says. Doesn't matter what the med staff. They can pull on them for, a second perspective. Mm-hmm. But if the ref says you're out, you're out.
Yeah, I've experienced that actually just in my own field work when I was working for the club in Waterloo. A couple referees actually had, and it's hard even for a therapist to see everything that goes on in a 15s game, but a ref actually said, like, this player needs to leave the field. And I know that a decade before, working in rugby, if I was trying to remove a player, I would be getting some flack from like coaching staff and stuff of like removing, their player from the game, because they're like, well, why do they need to be removed? And like, I had nothing really to prove back then, because there wasn't as robust of testing to do on the sideline even, or as much education. So like education has made some impact there. But I really think that taking it away from like removing the bias and having the referee as, like you said, that gatekeeper to protect the welfare of the athletes as well, removes the bias of like a coach or influence and pressure on a therapist, for example, of like that, like kind of more sport administration side. And I think that has definitely come a long way in that culture for sure. But it does definitely help.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with adult athletes as well, and trying to convince them to come off. It's like when the ref tells them to leave, it's like, well, they have no choice. They can, be upset about it, but they still have to leave the game. So that has definitely been a game changer, I would say. And I think that was honestly 2 or 3 years ago, probably now, that I had that happen. But it's been a great rule change that I think, like you said, doesn't affect the competitive level of the game necessarily. So yeah, that is incredibly interesting. And so just like moving ahead, like what is your goal, I guess, with now this research of like what do you see like as your future kind of, implementation of how you're going to actually use this type of stuff to influence changes and ideally kind of affect that cultural change rather than just kind of like you're saying like the individual behaviors, but actually the behaviors of everybody else surrounding the sport?
Well, I think it starts and so I think it starts with grassroots sport. It starts with amateur sport because when we see things like, I had mentioned that the referee has the power to do that in rugby, but in hockey they rely on concussion spotters. In the NFL they rely on anonymous concussion spotters, with the belief that if someone has to make the decision to pull an athlete, nobody knows who that person is. They're not going to catch flack for it. Whereas again in rugby, kind of taking a different approach is like, no, the referee's got that. That's cool. They can handle that. And so those are instances where that sort of change is happening. But in terms of changing sort of the broader culture around that, like I said, it starts at amateur sport. And so, it's all fine and great to say, yeah, we have concussion spotters. Yeah, we have sideline management with the pros, with NCAA athletes, with even, to some extent, university athletes for the most part. But then what about club rugby? What about, those junior leagues in hockey? What about, junior lacrosse? Are they going to have concussion spotters? Or do they have properly trained medical personnel at all their games? And, the research also says that in a lot of instances, more injury comes from practice than it does from games, but more severe injury happens in games. So do you have an AT or someone at a practice? The answer is no, right?
Yeah,
you might
for the
have a
most
volunteer
part.
or a dad or a mom who has their first aid, or maybe as a nurse. That happens quite often at the club level or that amateur level, but nothing's formalized.
Yeah.
And so those are the sort of areas I think that need to be targeted now that we see, education's coming a long way, awareness is coming a long way. We have these sort of broad policies in Rowan's Law where, there's mandatory education. You have to ensure the timely removal from play. You have to get physician clearance in order to return. There's some established standards now. But now the next question is, how do we make those effective? How do we implement those? And how do we build out support for those? Because right now, like I said, that education only goes so far.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I know that there are some incidents. I think it comes down to overall funding of, what kind of resources teams can access. I know that the more money a team has, for example, they can have an AT on site. And unfortunately, a lot of the high schools I know in my region, they don't have therapists at collision sport games. There's, I think, a couple school boards that are starting to implement that. But even at the high school level, they don't have football, rugby, everything. They don't have therapists there, and it's a huge risk for them and liability. But I wonder too, just kind of switching gears, but I was thinking about the influencers of, athletes in specific sports and sort of surrounding their culture of each sport. And I know that there's a lot more media that actually use high profile athletes in those sports to now be sort of the spokesperson for concussion. You see that with the national team. They kind of have the Canadian Sport Institutes. They've got their select athletes from kind of all across parasport and upright sports, and they've sort of got these key people there. But you wonder if more of from that perspective, whether I know that some cultures, they like to hear from people who understand their culture, and so someone like yourself, for example, would probably be able to affect more of a rugby culture because of your experience in that sport, and people would probably be more apt to listening to that and actually really doing something about it, rather than you talk about the education that's just the general course that every athlete has to take. It's do they really care about it because they necessarily the person teaching them doesn't have experience with their sport.
Right.
And you wonder if kind of those key profile athletes that are influencing younger athletes in general, if they're kind of like the spokesperson for these campaigns and things, whether that would influence someone to actually pay attention to it more.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways you can look at that. That's getting more into sort of public health and health messaging and stuff. And you can look at sort of other domains to get an idea of what this looks like. When, smoking cessation, for example, they started putting very graphic photos on cigarette cartons in a way to affect behavior change by appealing to sort of that emotional aspect of it. It works. There's different ways that works. Hearing about, athletes like Rowan Stringer, her story, that works in a lot of instances. Whether that is effective in particular to concussion in sport, the research is developing, so nothing's really conclusive at the moment. But right, there's different ways when you look at risk taking and risk taking behaviors. You can pull from other sort of domains of public health.
Mm-hmm. The messaging that really kind of hits home with specific athletes.
Yeah, and you mentioned the media and stuff, and I think that it both plays a very positive role in that the awareness of concussion now is far greater than we ever could have imagined with the support of the news cycle, essentially. Like, think of how often did folks in hockey talk about concussion until Crosby's out on his second concussion or third concussion, right?
That key that like high profile player that all of a sudden everybody's paying attention.
Right. And on the flip side, it might be a bit of a double-edged sword where it creates a sort of panic, or what can be done? Can anything can be done? Or should we just, not let kids play sports? Which, some people would make that argument, sure, especially, those who or maybe just contact sports in particular, or collision sports. I don't think that's the solution, because I think that type of sport brings different sorts of values in terms of youth development and physical activity and stuff. But it's a fair question. It's a fair concern, and what comes of that. We see lower participation rates at the youth level, sport participation rates. We see, a bit of a hysteria around concussion.
Hypersensitivity.
Hypersensitivity, right? And that's not saying that's necessarily misplaced, but the fact of the matter is people recover on average within 10 to 14 days from a head injury without any long-term consequences. Not everybody does, and not everybody recovers at all, and that the water gets a little muddy when it comes to multiple concussions, but at the end of the day, if properly managed, if properly recovered, does that mean your son or your daughter can't continue back to sports, right? So that's kind of the far other realm of what the media brings is it kind of brings, like you said, that hypersensitivity to questions like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just the boom and sort of the media and just like we had the Concussion movie come out a couple of years ago, and a few years ago now probably, and it's a lot of people are exposed to it in a sense that it almost, I think that's where we go back to like kind of the beginning. We were talking about your clusters of risk behaviors and those types of athletes. Like, sure, maybe they've heard so much about it now they've like almost stopped. They've become indifferent to it because they're just like, oh yeah, like I've gone through this, I've done this before. I can, whatever. I already know everything about this. And you almost wonder it's because they're like they think that they're, and that maybe comes down to a bit of an ego thing too, of like, do they think they know more than other stakeholders? Of like, perhaps they've like, I've gone through all those seminars, I've done all this stuff. Perhaps they're thinking now that like they could just manage it until probably they become the reactive player. And I think that probably could be a little bit more dynamic if they could switch into those clusters based on what their experience is and what happens to them. Because they might be more reactive when something actually does occur, and then they end up seeking out care for that.
Yeah, and I think, going back to some of that management stuff is, you want them to report, you want them to engage, and there might be some of those sort of misperceptions, or there's so much out there on this athlete may believe, I've done my research, I've looked online, there's millions and millions of concussion resources online now. And again, it comes back to my question of who's making those. Are they qualified? Do they know what they're talking about? Right. And they might be just bouncing off the common myths or facts kind of thing, but
exactly.
Is it really up to date? Even looking at stuff on some of the Canadian government websites is still pretty dated. Like they recommend in every situation full rest, where we know new research is suggesting gradual return to physical activity, which exactly what you do. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas the belief before was, no, just sit in a dark room and just hang out. Once your symptoms are gone away, then you can emerge.
And I think that probably created a lot of the negative experiences. And I do still hear of stories from practitioners who say really like permanent statements, and they create this perception around their concussion that this is it, you're dealing with this. Whether it's a neurologist or their physician, where they say, you know what, like, you shouldn't be doing anything, you're done, your sport. Like, it really grinds my gears when I hear like a healthcare practitioner tell someone they can't do anything anymore, because there's always a way you can still do something. It might not be at the same level, it might not be as intense, but you can build up to doing it, and potentially, there's other ways to play sports rather than just at the highest competitive levels.
Of course.
But it is really discouraging, because they haven't even reached their like recovery or potential for recovery, and they've already been told this like really permanent, this is it, you are going to experience this for the rest of your life type scenarios, especially at the varsity level, because again, those athletes have been playing sports for several years at that point.
Right.
And so it really, I think that I try really hard as a clinician to change those perceptions, and those people walk in my door, regardless of when I think their recovery is going to occur. It's something that I think needs to be. And I don't know when this is going to occur, because, it's been a long process already of this sort of evolution of change and perceptions. But where it's going to be more global across all the different stakeholders. Like, I know a lot of like I was saying, coaches are buying into it, parents are buying into it, and the referees, like everyone kind of around the sport. But at what point is it going to be sort of that whole process, like everybody through that process is going to be kind of on the same page? And that's kind of, I guess, the future of still where we're all trying to work towards.
Yeah, and I think you'd mentioned those sort of short and whatever recovery suggestions from like physicians and stuff, and I think that's reflective of the biomedical emphasis that the field of concussion has sort of revolved around. Here's this big injury. Well, how do we diagnose it, and how do we help people who have it? And that, those are biomedical questions, yeah. Right? How do we help folks recover and return to normal functioning? But what is missing, or maybe not missing I'll preface this with, in a practical sense, in a lot of cases, not necessarily in the literature, because there's a lot of fantastic research that's going on in this area, but I don't see it implemented very well, is, when an athlete is injured, or when anyone's injured, there's a physical response, but there's also a psychological response. And when you have athletes who perform day in, day out, who train day in, day out, they're active, they're engaged, their normal is the gym, their normal is the field. And then you're saying, no, you can't do that. You're injured, you can't do that. Sorry, your head's injured, so not only can you not do the part, work the part that's injured, so cognitive rest, but also physical rest, which differs from other injuries where I break my arm, well, I'll still run. I break my leg, well, I can, I don't know, you do like
right? Weights or something.
Do weights or something.
Body. Yeah.
There are options that doesn't change the fabric of my day to day as an athlete. And so, we get into questions around like athletic identity, and, how established is that idea, that sense of self, that idea that I am an athlete and that is who I am, impacted by an injury such as concussions. And that's, above and beyond anything in terms of, mood swings or any sort of emotional side effects that come as a result of that injury anyway. There are these psychological responses
and things like that too,
right?
Definitely evolves from that. And I've seen where like a lot of those meaningful habits or just like daily activities and more of their values are removed, that they don't know who they are, and that almost leads to that further kind of exacerbation of other things. I think is
for sure.
You remove someone's identity, and like kind of the post-traumatic stress of the whole thing kind of just starts building over time, and that leads to further issues psychologically more so. We see these psychosocial changes and evolution of personality over time too, when you remove like what someone has been doing for several years, and it's very abrupt. So like a lot of the time, like what I teach now is I teach a lot of the science, but it's also like make it meaningful so that even if it's just small interventions that aren't too intense or anything, like introduction to activity, but like do it at practice on the sideline so they're still involved and they can be there at practice or something, to sort of still give them that sense of belonging to their team, because that team to them is like almost their family in some cases when you're spending that much time with people. And so that can really cause a lot of more adverse things when you just pull it all away kind of in one go and just say, nope, you can't do any of this anymore. That's huge. No, I think honestly we could probably talk about this all day long, of all the different directions to go in, and I'm really excited to see your future research and kind of what you're coming out with soon, after your comps and things are done.
Yeah. One thing at a time.
Yeah, it's always, we have all these big ideas and all these, want to make these huge contributions, and you can somewhat make a small dent sort of a little bit at a time. But I know I think you're doing really awesome stuff, and it's so important to look at it from like this lens that you're speaking of, to kind of connect this like education to prevention piece and sort of like bridge that together. And yeah, so I wanted to, just before we wrap up here, if you want to speak to kind of, I guess, just like sort of the future of like what you have coming up or anything you have going on. I know probably studying right now, you don't have a lot, but you can speak to your podcast and different things you're trying to do with that.
Yeah. Lots of reading right now. Like I said, not too much writing at the moment, but I'm sure that'll come soon. A lot of what I'm doing is just really starting to frame what this means in a practical sense. Really trying to bridge some of that research and bring it down to, what does this look like as a rule change and what supports are needed for that rule change to be successful, kind of thing. And so a lot of time of mine is spent, like I said, either reading or just, thinking about questions and kind of developing that in my head, and through conversations with my supervisor and other folks in my lab. In terms of the podcast, even that, I mean, has been a little bit on hold, given the current state of affairs with the COVID situation. It's really hard to do a sports science podcast and sports related research when there's not any sports going on.
That's a good point.
Yeah. But I mean, if there's ever a good time to do it, it's for that to happen, it's while I'm doing my comps. So potentially the one. So that's what I keep telling myself anyway, the one silver lining from all this.
Yeah, definitely. But if anyone is interested in checking out that podcast, it's called The Athletic Perspective. Do you want to just mention how people can find you on social media and find the podcast?
Yeah, so you can check out the website, so athleticperspective.com. And we have a Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram, where we post lots of fun content and stuff like that relating to our guests and our episodes. And there's a blog component to that too, which has kind of taken the back seat a bit. But now that I'm about to get into that writing mode, I'll start to have some regular blog posts as well. So if you're interested, check it out. The whole sort of gist of the podcast is bridging that sort of science and sport with the experience of athletes. So we're not just talking about statistics, or not just talking about more of the sport in terms of like an interview like you would get on some sport podcasts with athletes, but really bridging that with the science. So if I'm talking about something like concussion, it's all bring in some of the science aspects of it and discuss that with the athlete in relation to their lived experience with that.
Yeah, I think that's really awesome. I was on your podcast as
You were
well,
on
and
my
that was a
podcast, yeah.
super that was a fun time.
So definitely check that episode out.
No selfish plug for me there. But yeah, you've had some really great athletes on there too, and across like a spectrum of levels of play, and also across abilities too with parasport and things as well. So it's really been interesting. I've enjoyed those episodes quite a lot.
Great.
So I think we'll just we'll wrap things up there. So thank you so much for joining me again today and taking the time away from your studying to speak with me today. And thank you to everyone for listening to the Thrive Neurosport podcast series. You can find me on Instagram at Thrive Neurosport. And if you're interested in learning more about clinical neurosport education, you can check out my website, thriveneurosport.ca. But until next time, keep on thriving on, friends.
Concussion Talk podcast is presented by HeadCheck Health. HeadCheck Health bridges the gaps in concussion care through simple, powerful technology. Join organizations like the Canadian Football League, Track Factory Racing, the Canadian Junior Hockey League, Eastern Washington University, and Volleyball Canada, who rely on HeadCheck Health to improve communication and optimize care. Visit headcheckhealth.com for more. Music at the beginning of this podcast is by Ben Sound. www.bensound.com.